off the recording when it comes to discussion time. So that's some very important things to remember anyway. We need God in the middle of our relationships. We need the Lord to be the one to make the difference. I've always said that God is the glue in marriage and relationships, that without him, we cannot survive. So again, with this triangle, there's a number of triangles involved with marriage. This one shows the husband and wife, are kind of the bottom here, but as you get closer to God, you also get closer to each other. So the more two people get close to God, the more they'll be drawn together. And that can apply in many different ways. I often said I wanted to find my wife in the prayer room. And as we both got closer to God and went to the prayer room, I found her there when we were in Bible school. She was in the prayer room. And, that was one of the indicators to me that this was someone that I would be interested in spending my life with. Just moving on here. So we need the Lord in our lives. We need the Lord in our marriages. God designed marriage, first of all. So when we see a young couple get married, or maybe not even so young, we want to see them really commit to one another, but also to commit to having the Lord be part of that equation, that God is the center, that God is love, God is the author of love, God designed marriage. So we recognize that we cannot have marriage without the Lord. So marriage cannot be kept without spiritual transformation. You see here on our screen, these 10 commandments we're not going to find in the Bible laid out like the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, but the principles are certainly in Scripture. But the first marriage we find was with Adam and Eve, of course. And everybody likes to tell Adam and Eve jokes, but there's some key points here. These are 10 biblical principles that are best revealed in the intimacy of marriage. For example, an unmarried man or woman may not realize how selfish she is or how poorly she communicates. But when you start to be in a marriage situation, now you're living with this person and it reveals things about yourself that maybe you hadn't noticed before, because that other person mirrors it back to you. And we live with someone who knows us warts and all and accepts and loves us anyway. Our shortcomings in areas such as selfishness, anger, communication, or forgiveness will be brought into the light. If you struggle with forgiveness and you get married, that's going to be very obvious. It's going to come out. Any of these areas, you can't remain married very long if you're going to hang on to that. So marriage forces us to grow and mature, and marriage will force us to overcome some of these things, because in order for the marriage to survive, we have to overcome our anger, our communication issues, or unforgiveness. And that's one reason why I believe God designed marriage the way he did, that marriage is one of God's greatest tools to mature his people. So it forces us to grow up. Let me just see what our next slide is here. Okay, so just like the 10 commandments given to Moses, these 10 commandments of marriage will act as a diagnostician, probing and revealing the unhealthy aspects of your marital relationship. So we're going to look at that in a bit, but before we do, we're going to talk about some foundational things here with Adam and Eve. Just imagine, Adam could truly say to Eve, "You're the only girl in the world for me." She really was. She was the only one available. And Eve could never turn around and say, "Let me tell you about the guy I could have married." They didn't have any of that baggage. So they had the perfect love relationship. There was no, before the fall into sin, they had, everything was perfection. They were innocent before God. They walked with God in the cool of the day. There was no sinful nature. So the selfishness and anger and the things we talked about here earlier, none of that was there. They had just the perfect harmony and paradise, and everything was wonderful. The Bible tells us that Adam and Eve walked around the garden naked, but felt no shame or embarrassment. And their nakedness went beyond the merely physical. They remained totally transparent with one another and with God. So God had promised this couple great blessings, given them the run of the garden with just one condition. You know the story. Said, you can eat of any tree you like, except for this one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Day you eat of it, you shall surely die. And we know what happened. Satan entered the picture. He began to tempt Eve. He said, shall you, indeed, has God said, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden. You shall not surely die, the serpent hissed. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So he deceived Eve into thinking God was holding out on her, and that it would be a wise thing for her to eat of the fruit and become wise like God. So this was her deception, was that she thought she was doing the right thing. So that's how she was deceived. But then she tricked Adam, not really tricked him. Adam flat out knew he was doing wrong, and he also disobeyed. So then we have this very tragic end to this paradise that they had, where they now fell into sin and permanently marred all of humanity, because all of humanity was present and fell into sin. And we can see history's first marital battle happened right then and there. This tragic chain of events set up the first selfishness-induced marital battle in history. When God confronted Adam about his sin, the man responded by blaming his wife. Lord, it's not my fault, it's hers. He used different words, but he intended exactly that accusation. The Bible reports that he told God, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit and I ate. Now he's even blaming God. When God turned to Eve to hear her side of the story, she didn't know better. She blamed her surroundings and her circumstances. God, I can't be held responsible for this. The serpent deceived me. Blame him for this. The thing is, they both knew better, but neither one would take responsibility. And the whole sordid scene provides a vivid and ugly picture of selfishness in action. It reveals two people giving into temptation, sinning against God and against one another, then covering for themselves, all in an attempt to avoid accepting the blame and the consequences for their sin. The husband blamed the wife and God, while the wife blamed her circumstance. Does this sound familiar? How many marital battles are similar to that one, in that it's a blame game and trying to just look out for number one? So the number one problem in marriage, our first commandment deals with the number one problem in marriage, a setback that cropped up in the garden with Adam and Eve. Since we've seen it continue all the way to the 21st century, it remains the number one problem in your marriage and mine. What is it? Selfishness. Selfishness is the number one problem in marriage. I keep fading out, my wife's telling me. All right, I'm gonna have to back up a little bit. Hopefully that will help. I've learned a few things, but my microphone, it sometimes I cut out if I turn my head down too close. All right. So that brings us to this number one problem, and that is selfishness. And we've seen a major turn towards self in the last, 50 years, just in psychology and all these different things. Everybody's consumed with self-esteem and self-help and self-actualization, all these terms about self. And people have become more self-centered than ever. And that brings us to our number one commandment: thou shalt not be a selfish pig. So this first commandment calls us to do in marriage what the Apostle Paul instructs all of us to do. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But our number one problem, selfishness, makes it tough. Perhaps we could take some positive steps towards incorporating this commandment into our marriages if we look at the problem of selfishness as a disease. We're gonna look at this disease called pigitis and see what we can diagnose here. So the we're going to look at the itis here. So you think of pigs at the trough, they're all shoving and pushing and trying to just get the most for themselves. We don't want to be like that. So most illnesses reveal visible physical symptoms. Selfish pigitis is no different. Its symptoms are as obvious as those of chickenpox. So we're going to do a little self-diagnosis as we go through here. I'm not going to try to diagnose pigitis in anybody here, but it's going to be up to you to look into yourself, not your spouse, yourself. Just to be clear. Don't everybody starts pointing the other way, that it's exercise of futility here. So immaturity is the I in itis. So first thing we find with immaturity. So puppy love is how a lot of couples start out. This is Immature form of the love dynamic that binds two people together. When we are in puppy love, we want to be with a person because how he or she makes us feel. In puppy love, our emotional and physical needs take center place in the relationship. And like those pigs in the slot, we push aside anyone who doesn't satisfy and gratify our needs. Many of us start with puppy love. Nothing wrong with that. It can be fun and enjoyable, but unless puppy love grows into mature love, the marriage will struggle and may not survive the trying times. If you build your marital relationship on puppy love, you'll end up living a dog's life. So you don't want to get stuck in a dog's life. So let's consider the contrast between puppy love, mature love in the chart here in front of us. So puppy love focuses on receiving. Mature love seeks to give to the other person. So it's more about giving than receiving. Puppy love is impatient, self-centered. Mature love is patient in spite of others' flaws. Puppy love tends to outbursts of anger. Mature love responds gently and appropriately to irritants. Puppy love is self-protective because it focuses on meeting its own needs above all. And mature love is transparent and vulnerable. The answer to the problem of puppy love is maturity. And that means living, as Paul puts it in Ephesians 5:15, with wisdom toward one another. We're to live and conduct our marriage as mature men and women in Christ. Unfortunately, however, far too many of us never grow beyond immaturity in either our married or our spiritual lives. While Jesus tells us to be childlike, immature people are childish. So we don't want to be childish. Sociologists and psychologists agree that America suffers a crisis of fatherhood, partly because so many men never grow beyond adolescence. Their bodies age, but their minds still think like immature kids. And that's probably a result of our culture. But you see fully grown men that really never matured intellectually. They're just still thinking like teenagers. Men and women too experiment constantly with new ways to satisfy their desires. But even the most immature can acquire wisdom as they study and embrace God's principles. So this something we pursue throughout our life. It doesn't end just because you reach a certain age. You can't say, well, you're 40 now, so you must be mature. This is something that continues throughout our life, that we're constantly growing and maturity. So that brings us to the T and the itis. So immaturity, time choices. How do you spend your time? The Apostle Paul tells us to redeem our time, Ephesians 5:16. Literally, we are to buy up all the opportunities time can bring us. And Ed Young tells a story of, in fact, he enjoys golf, so he's been known to go to the driving range, and he gets there, and there's this guy that's there every time he goes. And he's always there before he gets there, and he's usually still there when he leaves. And he makes the point, you know, how does this man have a family life if he spends all his time at the golf course? He must have a wife and kids that are, you know, missing him at home, but he spends all his time by himself at the golf course. And, you know, he said, one man recently told me, I struggle with selfishness in my marriage in the area of leisure time. I grew up loving sports and would spend hours watching it on television. During the first several years of my marriage, I noticed that many of my evenings were spent not with my wife, but with ESPN. And that's a symptom of pigitis, when all of our leisure time is spent on things that make us happy instead of with our spouse. Now, that's not to say that someone can't have a hobby or enjoy some time alone, that sort of thing. But when it's all being used up on ourselves and we don't have any time left for our spouse and they're getting the leftovers, there's a problem. It's very important that we make the relationship a priority. And if we take the opportunity to gain more joy and increase intimacy with our wives, if we just not spend so much time on our own stuff. It's easy to spend our time on our careers, our hobbies, our avocations, other self-gratifying activities, all at the expense of our marriages. I can't begin to tell you the number of people I've known whose marriages have suffered because one or both partners became too busy to make time for the relationship. You know, time matters. We only have so much of it. And it's so important we spend time with our families, starting with our spouse. And that's so important. Husband and wife seem to inhabit different worlds. How many, you've probably known couples like this, you know, they're married, but they're basically living under the same roof as roommates while they each have their own lives. They have their own interests, their own friends, you know, they don't even hang out in the same social circles. Everything's different. but they live under the same roof, and that is a tragedy. Leftover food might make a tasty meal, but leftover time creates a bland relationship. That if we don't make our spouse a priority, it's going to be a problem. So that brings us to our next I in the itis, and that is, or I guess we have a slide here. Give your spouse your time and undivided attention. Don't just be present, be in the present. So, that guy that's got his nose in the paper, or he's watching YouTube or whatever, and his wife's trying to get his attention, set it down and give her your full attention. That's so important. And vice versa. I mean, we pick on guys here, but it works both ways. But it's so important. It tends to be more of a guy issue. But don't give each other leftovers. Don't spend all your leisure time doing your own thing at the expense of your spouse. It's just dangerous. Insensitivity is our second I. If I had known he was so insensitive and unfeeling, I never would have married him. I've heard that complaint from unhappy wives more times than I care to count, Ed Young says. I sympathize with the feelings that spark such harsh words. They often come from a frustrated wife who feels unappreciated, who believes that her husband doesn't care about her needs or what she's thinking or feeling. Insensitivity kills a marriage and can destroy any kind of relationship, not just marriage relationship, but any relationship. It's hard to live with, work with, or associate with an insensitive person. No one wants to spend time with someone who doesn't listen or give any consideration to the feelings or thoughts of others. We kind of covered this in our last series when we talked about leadership, but it's so true even in the home that we listen and show sensitivity toward one another. Ephesians 5:17, Paul provides a model of what sensitivity looks like. It says, so then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Two contrasting words take the spotlight in this verse, foolish and understand. This verse tells us that foolishness follows a lack of understanding. If I'm not trying to understand my spouse, that's foolish. I'm destroying my own home, my own relationship, my own marriage by not showing sensitivity toward my spouse. So important. And there's so many ways that you can show sensitivity to one another. And he tells a story of a couple that got married, and he had a sporting goods business, and she really enjoyed art, and she'd been selling her art and making some money at it. But then they started to have a family, and they thought, well, she would give up her business and basically look after the kids. But she found her art was a really good way to kind of escape from the chaos of all the kids. So he began to realize that was important to her. So he backed off on his business a little bit and started watching the kids Tuesdays and Thursdays so she could paint. And she was able to actually get slotted a local art gallery and sell her work and all this kind of thing. And that was the result of sensitivity. He realized, she needed the break from the kids. So he began to back off his own business and let hers flourish a little bit. And that's a great example where, I've known couples where the guy thought that his wife was supposed to change all the diapers in the home. It's just, that's, insensitivity. It's so hard. Ask yourself a couple of questions. As a wife, are you sensitive to your husband when he's in the middle of a pressure-packed time at work? As a husband, are you sensitive to your wife when she's struggling with her boss or with the children? Are you sensitive to one another during those times when you don't just feel like yourself? Insensitivity is a classic symptom of pigitis. It causes us to live foolishly and our marriages suffer. The issue is when we're selfish and all we think about is our own feelings, we're not sensitive to the feelings of the other person. Again, how we started off here, what's it like to be married to me? What's it like to have to live with me? What's it like to have to put up with me? And you start to think that way, and it will really help. That brings us to the S in pigitis, and that is stubbornness, also known as pig-headedness. So it's, we don't want to be pig-headed. Definite symptom of pigitis. Seems only fitting that one symptom of pigitis is stubbornness or pig-headedness. And nowhere do we see stubbornness in marriage more clearly than in the area of submission. Paul uncovers this problem in Ephesians 5:22 when he writes that wives are to submit to their husbands as they would to the Lord. Some husbands believe this verse puts them in charge, and no matter what conflict or disagreement arises, that what they say goes. Only one problem. That's not what this verse means. Probably one of the most misquoted verses in the New Testament. The right before the apostle says that wives should submit to their husbands, he states that all Christians submit to one another, motivated by reverence for Christ. We're all to lay aside the stubbornness that characterizes our fallen nature and consider the needs of others. Sometimes this includes husbands submitting to their wives. Oh, shock of all shocks. Actually, what the scripture is telling us here, in fact, he says, let's read it, Ephesians 5:21-25, submitting yourselves to one another in the fear of God, to one another. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, okay, that was to the wives. Now husbands, this is to you. Love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. So he was writing to us and telling us, look, we need to be willing to lay down our lives for our wife. And they say, oh yeah, I'd gladly die for you, honey. Oh, will you live for her? You might be willing to take a bullet, but are you willing to give up what you want? That's kind of going back to what we've been talking about with self-denial and crucifying our flesh and all those things. Well, it might seem easier to take a bullet for your wife than to take the garbage out, but really it isn't. It's giving up some things when your wife asks you to do something when you want to do something else. That's really what this is about, giving up your own desire to please your spouse. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Are you willing to crucify your flesh for your wife? Are you willing to die, or not just die physically, but die in the sense of death to your own will and desires and what you want to do? So the key here is mutual submission. And this is what the passage is teaching when we take it in context. It starts off by saying submit to one another, and then it ends off with saying men should love their wives as Christ loved the church and even gave himself for it. So that's pretty radical submission in my books, that we are to love one another. Mutual submission is the key here. Ephesians 5:28-29, so ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. You want to do yourself a favor. Love your wife to the best of your ability and watch her respond to that love. And it will cause your marriage to blossom and flourish, and you will really see, make a great difference. All right, so diagnosis and treatment of pigitis. It's time to look in the mirror. Do you suffer from pigitis? Or look into the camera, I guess we could tonight. Do you suffer from pigitis? That's the question. Do you see yourself in one of the symptoms just described? Immaturity, insensitivity, or stubbornness? Do you tend to misuse your time or give it to your personal activities or interests, leaving your mate the leftovers? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you suffer from pigitis. Sorry to be the messenger tonight, but if that's you, you've got pigitis. Issue is most of us have pigitis. Most of us have pigitis. I see hands going up. I see that hand. We're just not going to have too many confessions here, but what do we do when we have pigitis? There's some answers here. We can look at some things to overcome selfish pigitis. So there's another fun acrostic here. You need some pep. You need pep to overcome pigitis. And oh, where'd I go here? So pep is get on the same page in your priorities. So priorities will help. That's the first ingredient in treating selfish pigitis. I mentioned it earlier, but our SYMBIS assessment will help with this. So if you find your wife or your husband and you are having different priorities and you're battling out what's important, what you want to, you have different goals, SYMBIS can help with that. But it can be very helpful to work together on the goals that you have as a couple. When two people don't work toward goals important to both, selfishness easily comes into play. usually the goals of one become dominant. So, you know, he wants to buy a new boat, she wants to buy a new car, and they're going to fight over the money until one of them gets their way. You know, that's that's a recipe for, you know, some disaster if selfishness is ruling the day. But when you have goal setting between the two of you, you can find a way to make it happen. He gives an example here of, you think of ticks on a dog. You know, he had this dog, and he said, you know, he couldn't, had the collars and the everything else for it, and given it tick medication, it was always having ticks. And ticks, they just exist to suck the blood out of their host. Many people, when they come to the altar and they're saying their I do's, they're thinking this person's going to meet all my needs. And they just get stars in their eyes. This person, they're going to meet all my needs. It's going to be wonderful. You know, they're just going to solve all my problems. The problem is the other person's thinking the same thing. And you have two people, you don't have a dog in the relationship, you have two ticks. It doesn't work. And you wonder why it doesn't work, because you can't do that. Nobody can meet all of your needs. No human being can do that. Only God can meet your needs. You know, that person can be, you know, a comfort to you, a blessing. You know, you can have a wonderful, vibrant marriage and all those sort of things, but your emotional needs are only met by God. So when people start thinking that that other person is going to meet their needs, that's a tick on the dog relationship. So they're looking to that other partner to meet their needs, and they're feeling sucked dry all the time because it's just this needy person. Neither partner's legitimate needs get met as each tries to feed off the other, and that's a disaster in a relationship. Certainly it's normal to have some expectations of your mate in marriage. That's part of the I do promise. It's vital, however, that every couple clearly communicate their expectations. That's why the second ingredient of our treatment for Pugitis is defining expectations. Again, I'll refer you to SYMBIS or SYMBIS Plus for that. It can be a great way to help make those clear, and that can ward off a lot of problems when you know what is expected of each. Expectations are usually a result of your upbringing. So if in your home, growing up, your mom looked after the bills, and your spouse, when they were growing up, it was their dad looked after the bills. The two of you get married, and you each expect the other person to look after the bills. So who looks after the bills? Nobody. And then your finances are a mess because you're both expecting the other person to be the one to look after the finances in the home. And, you know, it's just never talked about. You never discuss it. It's just a disaster. Well, you need to sit down and work it out together and decide who's going to do what. But because the expectations are usually silent and nobody ever talks about them, they become major sources of conflict in marriage. That brings us to patterns. So the final ingredient to Pugitis treatment involves getting your lifestyle patterns together. When two people marry, they bring into the relationship different ways of dealing with life. Every home is unique, and we bring those unique lifestyle patterns with us to the altar. Some of these patterns may need to be broken, while others embraced. Suppose a husband comes from a family that showed its affection much more than did his wife's, or perhaps some members of his family were very frugal while his wife spent readily. Take time with your mate to get your lifestyle patterns together. How will you make decisions? How will you resolve conflict? How will you handle money? How will you discipline your children? You know, even if you know each other fairly well, you're still going to have to work out some of these patterns and decide, you know what, there's never been a marriage like yours before. You're going to have to work on it together to carve a new path for yourselves. So priorities, expectations. Oh, I fell behind on my charts here. All right, so that brings us to the road to recovery. Love is the answer. So we know the solution to every struggle in marriage and all these different things, really it boils down to love is the answer. Well, what is love? You know, some people say they love pizza, some love their pets, you know, some love God, some love each other. Love has a pretty broad range of meaning. So what do we mean by love? Well, in the Greek, there's three different words for love that are most usually thought of. So the first one is feelings love, or eros in the Greek. So this is, that initial attraction that people have for one another. One guy wrote a poem. He said, I climbed up the door and shut the stairs. I said my shoes and took off my prayers. I shut off the bed and climbed into the light, and all because she kissed me goodnight. So that's that's feelings love. This, it just, you're all caught up in the emotion of it, and all of that, and that's not bad. God designed human beings to fall in love. That there should be this, wonderful feeling of falling in love, and that happens when attraction is there, and the couple starts to notice each other and all this sort of thing. And there's that initial wonderful feeling of falling in love. Well, science tells us that that's a bit of a chemical reaction that lasts about 2 years. That's God's way of making sure that your relationship is off to a great start. It's also a good reason not to have a long engagement, because those feelings will wear off before you even get a chance to get married. So you kind of need those in your first year of marriage while you're battling with each other to have those feelings to overcome any rough edges you're trying to work out. Song of Solomon's a great biblical example of this kind of love. You have all these physical attraction and passion and all of that. It's wonderful. So it is a vital part of marriage. However, in that time, you want to be building a foundation for when those feelings wear off, because they will only last so long. Give attention to your relationship. Always advise couples to keep dating with each other. Husbands need to court their wives with the same dedication they need to win their love. Wives should make their husbands feel as special as a knight in shining armor. Science has also told us that after these 2 years of initial falling in love feelings, if the relationship is maintained, there can be another chemical that is released that lasts the lifetime of the individuals, that results in long-lasting, deep feelings of love for one another. And that's where everybody wants to get to in their marriage, where you have these deep, abiding feelings for one another, and that will last a lifetime. So this takes attention. It doesn't just happen automatically. You can't just coast. There has to be some dating and romance that you still put into your relationship. Just because you're married doesn't mean you don't get to date anymore. That should be a priority for every couple, in my opinion. That there needs to be at least a weekly date for each couple, that you're spending time with nobody else. You're not inviting the neighbors over. You're not going out with people to wherever, but there's some time spent together, just the two of you, and that is so important. Otherwise, your relationship will die due to neglect. You don't want that to happen. Secondly, activate your will. Even if you don't feel the same emotions you once did, activate your will to do the things you naturally did back in those days of passionate romantic love. Imagine your life as a train. Your will is the locomotive and your emotions are the caboose. Once the locomotive starts moving on the tracks, the caboose follows. So don't concentrate on your feelings. Feelings are important, but healthy emotions can't be generated by feelings alone. Commit to actions that benefit your mate and then watch as the feelings rekindle. You can relight that fire by doing the right things, and you just consistently do them, and you might not feel anything the first few times, but you have to keep doing the right thing, and then it will, your feelings will catch up. Stay on the tracks. That's the other thing. Considering the following tracks laid out in Scripture. First obligation we have as a husband and wife is obvious. Love your mate as a cherished husband or wife, Ephesians 5:25 and Titus 2:4. Bible instructs both husbands and wives to love one another. Unfortunately, some people have trouble with that mandate. We are commanded to love our spouse by Scripture, by God. We are commanded to love our spouse. It's not really optional. The second level of our track might be easier for them. Love your mate as a fellow believer. We're supposed to love one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. We should be able to love our spouse at least at that level. If you still don't think you can fill this bill, then do your best to comply with the third biblical level. Love your mate as a neighbor. We're called to love God and love our neighbor. We should be able to love our spouse at least as much as we love our neighbor. The Lord teaches us to love our enemies. If you can't love your mate at least as much as you love your enemies, then you probably have some problems that go beyond the marital realm. We should be able, Jesus said, love your enemies. Well, practice on your spouse if you have to. But, we should be able to love our spouse in at least one of these categories. If we can't, there's a problem. And it's probably a problem we're having with God. All right, that brings us to the one of the other words for love in the Hebrew, or sorry, in the Greek is phileo, where we get the word Philadelphia, for example, is a city of brotherly love. Someone said this, I guess it was in a church bulletin after their wedding. It said, Irving Jones and Jesse Brown were married on October 24th. So ends a friendship that began in school days. I hope their friendship didn't end just because they got married, but many people seem to assume that's what happens. Oh, we're married, our friendship's over. It shouldn't be that way at all. In fact, the best marriages, I believe, happen when best friends marry. And, I married my best friend, and, it has just been a wonderful, wonderful thing to have that friendship carry on all the way from when we first met. And that's a wonderful thing. Praise God. I already covered most of the stuff here, so we'll skip over it. Okay. So in such a marriage, the husband and wife can honestly say they married their best friend. Such couples have so much in common that they enjoy one another's company, even apart from marriage's sexual aspects. So it's more than just physical attraction. Couples who count each other best friends consciously choose such a relationship. You got to remember that love is a choice. It's not just feelings. And feelings are wonderful, but love really is a choice. And love is continuing to make that same choice over and over again, which we'll get into in a later lesson here. It's often said that marriage is friendship that catches fire. If your marriage includes feelings love and friendship love, rejoice, it's on the mend from pigitis. You're on the right track. It's always been a height of irony to me that couples that I've known would say, oh, well, we don't want to date because it would destroy our friendship. I'm like, if you marry anybody else, that's going to destroy your friendship. That friendship better be ending if you get married to anybody else. So if you want your friendship to last at all, you need to get married. Don't fool yourself. Your future spouse will be quite jealous if you continue this friendship with the opposite sex. If you really want to preserve that friendship, you better take it a little deeper. But anyway, it's always been a laughable thing to me. Even when I was in college, I'd have friends that say, oh, well, we don't want to ruin our friendship by getting married. The best marriages are when friends marry. So that brings us to our next thing, and that is forever love. Feelings and friendship love are both based, at least to some degree, on mutual enjoyment, satisfaction, and fulfillment. I found so much happiness in the romantic and friendship love. Young here saying with his wife, said he's trusting his wife, found the same thing. But forever love cares so much for another that he or she gives with no expectation in return. So when you give the way God gives love, you're not expecting anything in return. It's unconditional love, we would say. In this marriage, this type of love endures the ups and downs of feelings love and the highs and lows of friendship love. This is the love that transcends romantic feelings and surges of devotion. It's not based on feelings, but on an enduring commitment. Eros love is a matter of the body. Philia has to do with the soul, but agape is an issue of the spirit. This agape love, it's constant. It makes the marriage secure. It's choosing to love no matter what, without any expectation of return, that we're just going to love this person sacrificially. And only God can give us this kind of love. So if God is love and God is agape love, then we can rely on him to fill us with his love so we have that love to give. We ask the Lord to fill us with his love, first of all, so that we can give that love in return. The Bible provides a classic description of agape love through the following words and phrases, adapted from 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. Patient, kind, not jealous, not boastful and arrogant, does not behave inappropriately, does not seek its own interests and primarily, does not hold grudges, does not rejoice in wrong, but in truth, carries all burdens, not cynical and distrusting, hopes in all situations, endures everything that comes against it. I find it an interesting exercise. If you can take 1 Corinthians 13 and put your name in there and say, Mitchell is not boastful and arrogant. Mitchell does not behave inappropriately. Mitchell does not seek his own interest primarily. Mitchell does not hold grudges. I put my own name in there, start to say, okay, that's what love looks like. I need to put my name in there and say, that's what I want to become, that I'm at that level, that I can say, that's the way I want to live. All right, it's well worth the effort. That's the main thing to remember here, that marriage is worth it. And, it isn't always easy, but it is worth the effort. In fact, outside of a relationship with Jesus Christ, marriage is the most sacred and most fabulous relationship God offers. When a man and woman learn how to put aside their own selfishness, give one another top priority, then their marriage can fill up with passion, satisfaction, and power. So some questions here for you, reflecting on your relationship. In what specific areas of your relationship with your spouse or loved one do you find yourself behaving or thinking selfishly? You might want to think about that. What specific symptoms of pigitis can you identify in yourself? What kinds of expectations do you have for your marriage and spouse? How can you begin communicating those expectations to him or her? Please, please remember, your spouse is not a mind reader, and there's nothing that will be more toxic to your relationship than expecting your spouse to read your mind. Say it. God gave you a mouth for a reason. I've seen so many marriages where they thought their spouse should just know. No, they won't. No spouse just knows. Nobody is born with hardwired knowing how to be a good spouse. Communicate, communicate, communicate. If you're not communicating your expectations, your spouse has no clue. And this is especially true of men. Because women are dialed into nonverbal communication like nobody else. Men, if you don't say it, they're not hearing it. That's just the way it is, ladies. If you expect your man to read your mind, you may as well become a lesbian, because they're not going to. And I'm not condoning that, but that's, many women have this expectation of their spouse that they think they should be just like them. And they're not. God created men differently, and you should expect them not to be like you. Take the love test of 1 Corinthians 13. Ask yourself if you're patient, kind, boastful, etc. to your spouse. And what areas do you need to improve? You can go through that 1 Corinthians 13 and say, you know what, am I following this? Am I, not boastful, not proud, all those sorts of things. Praise God. That's the end of our slideshow. Very good. I'm going to stop the recording here.